Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the first of what we hope will become a routine look at the world of identity and access management. My name is Jeff Steadman, and I'm here with Jim McDonald. We're both strategic identity and access management consultants with Identitropy's advisory practice. Jim and I have each been in the IAM space for over 15 years and have been in the trenches of real-world identity management programs, deployments, and operations. As far as my background, I've worked for several large companies running IAM operations globally. Jim, do you want to talk a little about your background?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Jim McDonald here. I joined Identitropy 7 years ago, and I've been in the advisory services group as well as I started and ran the ForgeRock practice for a while. ForgeRock is a IAM vendor focused on external identity and access management. And really, that's kind of my area of specialty. So my first IAM project was focused on, I was actually, when I was with a manufacturing company, I was responsible for the dealer portal. So I was kind of a web server and web application guy. I was more on the technical side of the house, but I was kind of transitioning in my career into getting into more project management, program management. At the time, I was just getting started with getting my MBA at Rutgers University. A little shout out there. And I got this opportunity to take our dealer portal and expand it across multiple brands. So taking a bunch of different web applications that were used for doing business functionality, like ordering complete machines and parts and submitting warranties and things like that, and had to pull it all together into one portal. We had our dealerships across the United States and somewhere outside the United States, and we had a lot of these applications that some users would have accounts in all the different applications with different usernames and things like that. And our drive to start with was to get to one ID and password per person, and that's a bigger challenge than you realize when you start going down that road. And so that's how I got into identity and access management, because we came to find out this is actual space. This is something that people were creating solutions for, and maybe that's Captain Obvious today, but 15 years ago, it wasn't, at least for me. So that's how I got into the space. And I always say, everybody's got their own story, how they got into IAM. And most of us stumbled into it by doing some other job and then found that, hey, we're all of a sudden on an IAM project and got into it at the right time, or even today. I think, if this is depending on, where you are in your career, if this is like an area that you're looking to get into, it's something I think that pretty much anybody with a business background or a technical background can get into IAM, and just, everybody has their own career pathway, I think, in this space.
It's interesting to say that. So I was at the Identiverse conference this past week in Washington, D.C., and I'm in the process of writing a blog article about this, but it's funny that you mentioned how you got into IAM, because I don't know anybody who got into IAM starting with IAM, right? I mean, they started maybe on the network side or help desk side, like myself. I started in the help desk and kind of moved over to an ID administrator before, moving even beyond that. But I don't know anybody in the IAM space that started in IAM. Do you know anybody that fits that bill?
I can think of one person, which was Mario Dusai, who's now with, is he with Transmit Security now?
Yeah, I think so.
And he was a developer. We brought him in, and for the bank that I was working for, we brought him in as a developer, and that was like 5 years ago. And that's what I think my answer to your question was 10 years ago, the answer would have been no. But I think more and more now, it's like the IAM space has gotten so big, and one of the things that we are always talking about is, the need for more talent to get into this area. Mm-hmm. And I think IAM is now in the place where it's like, like kind of a cottage industry where we have to go out and take people who don't necessarily have the skill set, people fresh out of college, and get them into IAM. Another example is Fletcher Eddington from our company. He was hired as an intern and he was doing technology deployments in the IAM space. And now he's on the sales side. Like, he's built his entire career around IAM. So I think it's more of a kind of a recent phenomenon, maybe within the past 5 years or maybe a little bit more. But yeah, people who've been in this space for a long time, most of us kind of stumbled into it one way or another.
Right. Yeah, it was interesting. You mentioned the intern thing when I was at the conference, and we were having an ID Pro organizational meeting, kind of like a get together meeting, i.e., drinking at a bar. And we were talking with a couple of folks from IBM, and they actually have an intern kind of process where they'll bring people in and have them kind of work around the different not engagements, like different departments in the IAM kind of consulting that they do, and they're trying to get more younger talent, into those groups as well. So they actually have a dedicated program to find those people, get them exposure and kind of help them figure out where in the IAM space they might fit, if they fit, right? If they don't, they tend to move on. But they're a big company and they're looking to get support, and from a talent perspective, and they actually have a kind of decade program, which I thought was pretty cool. And it's probably something I would imagine lends itself more to the consulting space, right? Bringing in folks and trying to get people in IAM. I don't see like an enterprise bringing people in and letting them kind of figure out where they want to be, to that level. But those folks at some point end up in the industry. That would be probably a good thing for all of us.
When I first got into IT about 20 years ago, there were a lot of different ways you could get into IT and kind of build a career. So there was, you could be a network engineer, you could be a server engineer, things like that. Well, a lot of those spaces have become commoditized, and then, smaller companies, mid-sized companies just outsource server hosting or network setup or voice over IP phones, phone systems. That was another entry point into IT back in my day. But today there's fewer and fewer of those. They're being commoditized and not necessarily moved out of the United States, but into bigger companies that I'm sure they have internship programs and things like that to get into as well. But IAM has been one of those spaces where it's evolving so rapidly, and a lot of small companies move into the space, and it gives opportunities for newbies or new people to move into the space and really build a career. And one of the things that I've always loved about IAM is that the people who I think are the most successful have, really good business skills, but enough technology skills to be dangerous, or vice versa. They've got really good technology skills and they understand business just enough to be dangerous. Or obviously, if you're really experienced with both, that's great. But you're solving business problems with IAM. You're really having to look at how do you do things today? How do you want to do them? Compare that with how does the software work out of the box, and having the business sense to know that you don't want to take something that you bought that works out of the box and customize it too much and then be stuck with kind of a Frankenstein system.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more to IAM than just technology, right? I mean, there's management, there's marketing, there's communication, relationship building. There's all, and I think maybe it's not clearly obvious unless you've been in the space for a while. It's not just a technology position. I don't consider myself overly technical. I know enough probably to be dangerous, but I'm not going to go out and write you code and and install and configure your system. But I certainly understand the macro concepts, how things are going to work together. How does this work in the real world at large companies, and change boards and software review boards and kind of all the company governance that tends to go around big projects. How to market out there. And one of the things I always say during our engagements, right, is from a program manager perspective, half your job is out there doing diplomacy, kissing babies, right, making relationships, making people aware of what are the services that you're offering. So that's probably a topic that we'll maybe cover in the future. What makes a good IAM program manager.
I think that's an excellent topic.
Maybe we go down that right road at some point. Um, so what do we want to talk about today?
I think what we should try to cover today is something that's kind of near and dear to what we do because we can, discuss it and based on our real world experience, but putting together an IAM strategy and, with the role that you and I are in, is just to be clear to everybody, what we do is we're the advisory services team at Identropy. So we parachute in with our clients who are kind of come to the realization that we need an IAM strategy. And then they at some point discover, "Well, we don't know how to make an IAM strategy." So I think we could talk about, the framework that we follow and kind of the process that we go through, because not every organization, not every IAM program manager can afford to go out and bring consultants in and help with the process. But I think the process is something that anybody could take on. And there might be some folks out there who are interested in just kind of understanding what we do and how we do it. So what I was going to kind of talk about was our framework.
Mhm.
And, I really like to break down what we do into three major parts. So it's assess, recommend, and roadmap. And so let me go through those three parts and and break them down further. But the assessment phase is really understanding how things work today. And I think this is important to understand where your starting point is. And really it's going to help you develop kind of where we're at today and what we want to accomplish, which is going to be that recommend phase, and then realizing the amount of work that needs to happen to go from point A to point B. Um, so normally with the assessment, where we start is we do a lot of we do a scoping exercise. So what we call it is our put chart. And the put chart is essentially processes, user types, and target systems. The whole idea and why we do that is to go through what is the scope of the IAM program, because IAM can mean many different things to many different people. But if you get an exhaustive list of like, here are the processes we want to go after, whether it's things related to managing privileged identities, user onboarding, user offboarding, authentication into applications, whatever. And maybe it's not all those things. Maybe it's just password management, and it's a more finite scope. But realizing what your scope is kind of the starting point. And one of the great things that comes out of that exercise is that as you go through something like who are the user types. So in other words, who are we doing these IAM processes for? You're going to realize, oh, here are the stakeholders that we need to get involved. If we're talking about external customers, for example, we need to get people who kind of within our organization are the person who's responsible for communication to those users, things like that. Who provides them support? In other words, when a user runs into an issue, where do they turn? Well, maybe that's the service desk. We're talking about employees. We're probably getting HR involved. If then as we go into target systems, say SAP or Salesforce is on the list. Well, we need to get people involved from those stakeholder groups. Now, all those people that we've identified, we then want to get them involved in a workshop. And a workshop would be, a series of meetings where we understand from folks what, how do things work today? What's working well? What's not working well? What ideas do you have for how to make things work better? And so that's kind of the starting point is, I guess, to break down the assess phase, it's, identifying scope, identifying stakeholders, and then meeting with those stakeholders, going through kind of the workshop activities. And that might be a future podcast as well, as like, what do these workshops look like? How do we structure the workshops? What are the questions? But what I like to do in the workshops, the way I like to see workshops run, is for them to be very interactive. It's
Right.
not for us to kind of be interrogating or just asking one-way questions and just taking notes. The more that we're interacting and whiteboarding or going through diagrams and process flow charts, the better. And then coming out of that, and kind of the reason we use the term assess is that some things are going to jump out at you right away, like, this process is broken, or this process works really well. This is a strength within the organization. This is a weakness. I want to make sure we document all those and then kind of be able to tell the story. What is it that needs to improve? What are the drivers for this program? Why is it important to do something?
Mhm.
So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Jeff?
Yeah, that's right on. I think one of the things that typically ends up being one of the hardest parts of the engagements that we work through with our customers is trying to get that attendance right for those workshops and having people be available. It is an investment of time, right, to get those folks in there, but it's certainly um, beneficial, definitely for the customer and definitely for us to be able to understand, well, how does it really work today, right? Because you can have things that are written down on paper and process, et cetera, and that's great, but that may not actually capture what's really happening, right? So if we can get folks in the room, set up a safe space, right, to have those conversations and figure out, how do we solve some of the issues that we hear, that definitely helps out quite a bit. When you talk about the assessment, I always find it interesting, and I know we both ask this question a lot. From an assessment perspective, are we right on? Does the customer agree with us, or do they have a different perception? So it's always interesting to kind of have that conversation and say, yeah, we knew that we weren't doing so great here, and that's kind of what we were expecting. I don't think I've ever come across one where we've done an assessment and provided, here's why we think you're X, and the customer saying, well, you're totally wrong. This is why we're so much better than what you think, right?
Great.
We're usually pretty right on with that. I don't know if you've ever encountered that from an assessment perspective, but I think companies kind of brace themselves for the worst, and maybe sometimes they're pleasantly surprised, or they agree with the assessment. But I've never seen the opposite, where they thought they were doing a lot better than maybe what they really were. After they
No,
came
I think you're right on with that point. One thing that or 2 points that I wanted to throw out there. One is, I, this is my perspective, is like, this is your strategy, because a lot of times and so that drives a certain perspective. Like, you don't need to know every iota of detail in order to make a strategy. You need to know what are
right,
the major areas of improvement. If the way passwords are managed is a problem, you don't need to know every different aspect of the password management policy, or from a strategic perspective, if you know that the tool is the problem, the tool needs to be replaced, then that really ought to drive the strategy. So you don't want to get burdened with too much detail. And I think a lot of times in the projects that we've worked on, some of our clients think, you guys are here, you need to know every detail. We need to meet with every stakeholder, anybody who has anything to do with passwords.
yeah,
And it's just not the case. The other point that I wanted to bring out is that, we talked about it as a workshop, and, at least from an identity perspective, these are engagements. So we're going in and we want to try and get all of this information in a week. So we try and schedule all the meetings in a week. I feel like if our listeners are going out and trying to do this on their own, they should take that same perspective. If you spread these meetings out over several weeks, or much worse, several months,
yeah,
you're going to lose momentum.
you'll never get it
You're going to
done.
You'll never get it done. You'll forget things. There's always going to be one more person to talk to, and it doesn't create an event. It doesn't create, like, one of the things I think about when folks hire us is that the consultants are coming in. They're going to be here this week. You need to be ready.
Right, make
Okay.
yourself available, right? Yeah,
Make yourself available. We're going to do one-off exceptions. You can do a phone call next week if you can't be there because you're on vacation or whatever the reason is. But we don't let it drag out 3 weeks. It's kind of like, if you can't talk for 3 weeks, your perspective's not going to be included. And I don't mean to be so harsh, and you don't really need to be that harsh. But if you have several groups who are saying, like, yeah, if it's just not important enough for them,
right.
that's a bigger problem. And so that is it to me. Is like, you've got to kind of create an event. You've got to have
There needs to be a sense
have
of
an
urgency around it, right? I mean, let's
perfect.
let's get people in the room. Let's get this conversation. We know it's an issue. We've got these, high-powered consultants coming in. let's take advantage of their time, set aside, the time so we can get this done. That's typically why I think it's one of the hardest parts, right? Trying to get those folks to buy into that process, get availability. The bigger the team, the bigger the number or larger number of the stakeholders, just becomes that much more difficult. So the other thing too, I think, is if we try to keep it more core and bring in other folks as needed, that sometimes can help with that as well. Because most companies, they typically have like a core kind of IAM team, whether or not they're truly a team or not. There's typically a handful of people who really know how it works, and then you've got supporting characters around that might be subject matter experts in a given area that don't necessarily need to be there full time. But we certainly would like to have an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours of their time, so that we can understand their side of it. That definitely comes into play.
Right. And so moving on from the assessment, I think you made a good point. We like to, with our assessment, bring it back to the client, have them review it, verify that it's comprehensive and complete. We didn't forget something. We didn't state facts incorrectly. Usually that's not the case, but it's good to do a quality check.
Mm-hmm.
And then we move on to making recommendations. And our recommendations are typically based on best practices. So we know what the problems are in the environment, and we know what are the common industry solutions. But more so than just technology solutions, it's there's some major themes that we generally look toward, like centralization, automation, consistent processes, so that say you're working with a large organization and they do things different ways in different departments, trying to drive toward one common way of doing things is those are the typical drivers. I'm not going to say that those work for 100% of organizations, but probably high 90s. Doing things from a central perspective, or at least having certain things done from a central perspective. Automating, it's not always the case that you want to automate something, but you want to have a framework for automating where it makes sense. So that's really what we do from a recommendation standpoint. And of course, Jeff and I have a lot of experience in this space, so we kind of, a lot of these things are second nature to us. But a lot of the benefits that you get and kind of some of these best practices, like I talked about, are also, if you think about any kind of enterprise project, if you're looking at an Active Directory project or something like that, it would be the same kind of theme: centralization, automation. So those are the drivers. One of the ways you can, if you're not working with a consultant, that you can start to get some ideas on how the industry solves these problems would be to start to bring vendors in to, present them. Here are the problems. What are your, how would you go about solving these problems? That's going to give you some information. Now, right. From the identity perspective, that's not how we operate, because we do it from a vendor agnostic frame of mind. We want to say, if we were in your shoes, this is how we would do it, and we base it on our experience. So I think anybody could implement the framework, but nobody can implement Jim McDonald's experience except for Jim McDonald, because I'm the only one who has my set of experience, and Jeff is the only one who has his, and everybody who's listening is the only person who has theirs. Right. But so that's kind of how we go about the recommendations. Kind of some of the major elements of recommendations are going to be, people, process, and technology. What are the things that would go about solving kind of the assessment, doing kind of a gap fit analysis? Here are the gaps and here are the recommended solutions. Another thing I would say is a lot of things that are going to come out of the assessment have nothing to do with technology. They just have to do with how you're running your IAM program. One of our recommendations is always, you got to run IAM as a program. I'm sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
No, you're right on. This is an area, I think, that it's easy to become overwhelmed, right? There's so many things that might come out of just recommendations, but a lot of it typically doesn't tend to be technology based, right? It's more on the process side. One of the questions that we like to ask, is why do you do it that way? And sometimes no one really has a good reason why, right? Just no one figured out or wanted to kind of rock the boat, and maybe we play bad cop, as part of the process, to say, okay, well, why are you doing it that way? What about this? And kind of ask those questions. You don't ask those, you'll never get a path forward sometimes. But it's easy to get overwhelmed, especially with some of our larger engagements where you may end up with like over 100 individual recommendations. You can't solve everything all at once, and that probably leads us into the next part here where we talk about roadmap. But how do you prioritize what goes first? Is self-service pass or reset more important because your help desk is drowning in those calls, or is privileged access management more important because you're not doing anything there, right? How do you figure out which area comes first?
Yeah, there's really no silver bullet for that. I mean, you've got to look at what are the drivers in the organization. Let's just say, you think the driver is automation. We go into certain clients and we just say, my God, you guys are drowning in risk, right?
Yeah.
So, and other organizations are driven by risk, and just say, wow, you guys could be doing everything so much better if you just had some automation. But usually it's a balance of all those things. It's risk, it's automation, it's opportunity for enabling new technologies, and certain things are going to bubble to the top. One thing that I think almost never wants to be heard, but is the case, is that if you're going to introduce a lot of new technology footprints, so say you're going to put an access management single sign-on system in place, you're going to have some, I don't want to call it heavy lifting, but there's some infrastructure that needs to be laid down. There's going to need to be some basic work put into play to configure the system. You're going to have to do, implement maybe one system as kind of a proof of concept, just to make sure that, nobody wants to do a big bang approach. Right. Even the smallest enterprises don't want to do big bang. So you've got to think about things in phases, but I'd say, more and more is moving to the cloud. The infrastructure phase is either eliminated or shrunk down considerably, but not everything is moving to the cloud. And this is a good blog topic or podcast topic for the future, is to talk about, access management, single sign-on is something that is moving out to the cloud dramatically quicker than the identity governance and administration space. And it's because companies, the way they do identity administration and governance varies much more from organization to organization. The fields they have to manage and govern and provision, there's so much more variance. Whereas single sign-on has really driven towards some of these federation protocol standards like SAML 2.0 and OpenID Connect, and those things have been able to move out to the cloud, and there's now integration patterns that will be able to take cloud-based single sign-on and connect it to applications that are even on-premise hosted. So, I guess what the point that I was making was, don't forget kind of the infrastructure phases. Don't think that you can just say our phase one is going to be just integrating applications, because you're going to have to get those early configurations and maybe some infrastructure spun up as well. So that's kind of the traditional element.
Well, plus they'll change too, right? I mean, if you're working on a roadmap, especially if it's like any roadmap beyond a year, right? There's going to be changes that come along the way, so you need to be able to be flexible and adapt, as things come down the pipeline. Right.
I think that if somebody's out there listening and say, well, how do I apply this to me? Because I can't afford to go out and get consultants. How am I going to build my IAM strategy? And I think the hardest part is less coming up with what I think anybody, maybe not anybody, but most of us can look at these problems, look at the vendor solutions that are out there, read what they say on their website, watch their YouTube videos, and say, I think this will solve the problem. The hard part is being confident that, yeah, it'll solve the problem. And so that's where I think that, one of the reasons why organizations want Jim and Jeff to come in to help is that, what we've seen, and we can base it on our experience to say, yes, we can be very confident. You don't want to come up with a strategy that you're not 100% confident in. If you don't have that experience, I think it really, you're going to have to go the extra mile and tap into whatever whatever resources you have available to you. And one of the ways I learned a lot about identity and access management was tapping into my colleagues at other companies and
Hmm.
my friends who are in the space and message boards and things like that, because there are people out there who love sharing information. Jeff, you and I are doing this podcast today because we love sharing information. There's ways to get the information, ways to get people's opinions. I'd say also within your organization, IAM is a technical beast unto itself, but a lot of the um, architecture design that you're going to do, you pull in some of the enterprise architecture team, or if you have other resources like that you can tap into to help to make sure that you're following good architecture design principles.
Right. Well, it's that experience. I think that's the important thing. But and this is one of the reasons why I moved into consulting was when you work for a single company, you know how they do it, and you know the tools that they use. Right. When you're in consulting, you're seeing how way more companies do it. You're getting much broader exposure to a larger number of tools, and you get to see much quicker what works, what doesn't work, how a particular issue might have been solved at one organization. And that's where that experience factor comes in, is you pull that situation over and say, okay, this is very similar to what we saw at company X. Now that we're company Y, yeah, you know what, we've seen something similar to that. Let's talk about how this might work. And that certainly helps. And I think that goes back to reaching out to your network, right, and trying to figure out, everyone struggles with very similar problems, for the most part. It's very rare that, not very rare, but a lot of companies struggle with very similar problems. So just leave it at that, right? And if you can talk with more folks in your networks, et cetera, and see how they solved it, there may be components of their solution that might be able to apply to fix your own. And once you talk to enough folks and try to get enough data points, you start to build that confidence level that, yeah, okay, here's the right way to approach it. So
Right.
having that broad network and being able to talk with folks, go to conferences, commiserate with the folks there. I think the other thing too is, be straight up and upfront with some of the vendors, right? So if you bring in a vendor and you've got a specific problem, tell them what it is and see how they would solve it, right? That might help you understand it. Sure, they're going to try and sell you their product, but take the information, and as you're comparing different vendors, see how each one handles it. You may find that the vendor A is better at what you're looking for specifically than vendor B, even though vendor B might be the big dog, right, in the industry. So there's no silver bullet, like you put it before.
Yeah. So after we go through assess, recommend, and roadmap, now you have your strategy. I think the final step now is communicate. Tell everybody about your strategy. Present it to your peers. Present it back to the folks that participated in helping you define what's working well and what's not working well. Get buy-in, right? And I would really start, if you can, kind of at more of the grassroots level, the people who participated, and then work your way up the channel so that you're presenting to an executive team, letting them know that you have buy-in, letting them know how you got to build this strategy, who you talked with, and that you've gone back to those teams and they're buying in. And in my experience, executive teams are going to want to know, does everybody agree that this is the solution? And then they're going to want to know, how much does it
cost?
Everybody agree, and how much does it cost?
Right.
So yeah, but I mean, and again, probably another topic for another time is really going about communicating, but that's kind of the soft skills.
Right. It's all about marketing, right?
It is that when you're at that point, it's all about marketing.
You've got to be able to communicate.
After you get approval and you start going into projects, that's where the technology is going to be, technical skills are going to be even more valuable, because, if you're a program manager and you're running projects, you don't want to get, technobabbled to death or tricked. You want to be able to evaluate that yourself and make sure that you get it. That was always my thing. If something was technology related that was, outside of my expertise, I'd say, explain it to me until I understand it.
Yeah.
And eventually I would not either understand it or they couldn't explain it to me in a way that I understood, and then I didn't want anything to do with it.
Yeah, if you can't articulate the value of whatever it is you're trying to do, and it obviously extends beyond just IAM, but if you can't articulate the value of what the IAM program is going to bring, what you're trying to do, you're not going to get the money to do anything. I mean, right? I mean, you have to be
That's
able
right.
to tell the story of why we're doing this, what's the benefit for it, and how does it make our life better, right?
That's right.
And that'll get you the money, theoretically, right? How much money is always up for debate. I mean, budgets are always a hot button item, and some companies may have set aside already money for that, or some haven't really, and some have been thinking about it for a while. And the longer you wait, typically the more you're going to have to spend up to get caught up, so to speak. But if you can't articulate the value or what you're trying to do, nobody's going to approve any type of spend for that.
Yeah.
So you want to be able to start to master that communication strategy of what are we trying to do here, why are we doing it, and why is it important, right? Those sorts of things. I think that provides a pretty good summary of our process. We could probably leave it there for now.
I agree. I think, our goal, I think, today was to kind of kick this thing off, right? To get started. And these are the types of conversations we'll have, dive into some more of these areas. This is really the plan part that we talked about today. We'll talk about build projects, about how to run an operations environment. Those are the kind of topics that people are interested in. I think they'll enjoy this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's pretty much a wide range of topics. Anything that's really identity related is probably in scope for us. Whether it's current events, topics that we see come up during our own advisory engagements that we're working on, any other items that we might come across that people might find interesting. And if there's a particular topic, or if you've got a question or even just general feedback, you can always email us at questions@identity@thecenter.com, and we'll be sure to read all those and take that and help plan out future episodes of Identity at the Center.
Awesome, Jeff. I think it was great.
I think that was it for our first one. So we're going to call it there, and thanks all for listening. Take care.